The most important part for me was that what we know about carbohydrates is they're highly inflammatory. And that's across the board. I mean, they're now calling Alzheimer's diabetes type 3. Western medicine is.
Type 3 diabetes.
So,
yeah.
Yep. And so what does that say? Carbohydrates, sugar, fruit, that's all inflammatory. And what happens when we get inflamed? We get puffy, we get water retention, our brain gets foggy. And it's, sometimes I feel like I want to get a bullhorn and say, people, get off the carbs. And of course, like you said, it's not a one protocol, because somebody like me who's training, 14, 15 hours a week, I might need some carbs now and again. But those are what you call strategic. And that's what I look at.
As a healthcare practitioner and an athlete, what would you be your advice to people?
Is I think educate themselves about carbs in general. I spent a lot of time with my folks, my patients, working with them to help them understand that carbs are not great. Not supposed to have
in chronic huge amounts.
Right. We're not meant to have fruit all year round. And the causes of inflammation when they're doing their carbs, people were afraid of fats for so long that it was horrible. And it's very hard when you have that brain thing, like input for years and years. So I tell my patients, this is what I want you to think about. I'm telling you now that so many carbs is not good. If you look at the old movies, people weren't overweight. People weren't obese. And I say to them, look at the children, look what's happening to our children. So do you think what our dietary guidelines have told us is working? I don't think so. More and more children are becoming obese now. And what we know about fat cells is that they hold on to estrogen. So we see a lot of kids that have, not just kids, have excess estrogen. So if you have excess estrogen, that sets you up for all kinds of health problems. That will never spike your insulin, right? Sugar, carbs will spike your insulin, which then can turn into fat. And what happens then is when you have too much sugar in your body, your cells will not allow anything in, because it's like they put gloves on. So your pancreas puts out, or your pancreas puts out insulin to try and clean up that sugar, right, of your body, because it said now the alarm went off, too much sugar. But what's happening is the cells are saying, I'm protecting myself. So insulin resistance, so nothing can get through. So now all your energy, the food you're eating, is not transformed and transported into the cells. So people start getting ulcers in their leg. You see this in diabetic people, because the cells are not being nourished, and that's very scary.
I've got this analogy, this thought of mine is that we're looking at insulin all wrong in today's modern society, because we're using it as a blunt sledgehammer to drive down blood sugar. General, right? That's what most people are talking about insulin. Even the low carb health experts are talking about insulin only from this standpoint that you need, if you're a type 1 diabetic or even if you're healthy as an athlete, insulin is what drives your blood sugar down, right? And we're using it, because we're using so much carbohydrates, we're using insulin as a blunt sledgehammer, whereas this other perspective, which is something I've been talking a lot about, and I want people to understand and think about, is in the context of where we are now, high carbs, it is a blunt sledgehammer. However, in the context of low insulin with carbohydrate restriction and high insulin, which is going to give you high insulin sensitivity, which means your cells are very sensitive to that.
Right.
Insulin is actually one of the most anabolic hormones after HGH and testosterone.
Right.
It's very anabolic, and that's actually what helps young children who have high insulin sensitivity get big, because milk, whether it's cow's milk or breast milk has what they call IGF, which is insulin-like growth factor.
Right.
And so when you look at it in that context, it's like, maybe we can use insulin to help us as an athlete and to be healthier by restricting carbs, getting our insulin sensitivity up, our insulin levels down. When I say down, not the reference range, I mean below 8, right?
Right.
Get into that sensitive level where we can use the insulin to help drive those anabolic processes.
Yeah. And we know there's a syndrome called PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, which many, many women have, and it impedes fertility. And all it is insulin resistance.
Yeah, it's a manifestation of insulin resistance.
That's all it is. And the thing is, because when you have too much sugar in your body, your hormones get all whacked out.
Yep.
So the best remedy for that is get them on 50 grams of carbs a day. They lose 10% of their body fat. And guess what? A lot of times they can get pregnant on their own, but nobody's telling them. They're putting people on metformin. They're using these, can't even pronounce some of the drugs they're now using for slowing the GI tract down to lose weight. It's scary.
Yeah, and it goes even further than that. So now for the audience, we're segueing into women in their childbearing years. PCOS is a manifestation of insulin resistance. But on top of that, with all those carbs, you've got all this energy the body has to dispose of now, because glucose is acutely toxic if it remains elevated, right? Because of the, part of it's that inflammatory load, right?
Yes.
So you have all this quote unquote energy, excess energy that's gone nuclear, and the body has to do something with it. So another facet, especially for women in their childbearing years, is cholecystectomies, which is a gallbladder removal.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That's like one of the most common procedures with women from their late 30s into their early 50s. And it's so common that in medical terminology, it's called the 4 Fs: female, fat, fertile, 40.
Right.
And this has to do with females who've had a couple of kids or not even had kids.
Right.
But they're getting too many carbs, too many calories. And because of that person's hormonal profile, that excess energy, some of it might be going to fat, but they're not getting obese. What's happening is eating a high carb diet is causing problems on the other end, which I'll describe in a minute. But part of what the liver does with that excess energy is it converts it into cholesterol, which then is shunted to the gallbladder as bile, because bile is made up of cholesterol, because now you're not making a baby, you're not nursing a baby, which are both cholesterol rich processes.
Right.
So that cholesterol's got to go somewhere. So it goes to the gallbladder. But since you're eating a high carb meal and you're snacking, because that's what they told us to do, right? Because you eat 5 or 6 small meals so you don't get those massive glucose spikes from 3 meals of high carbs, low fat. You're not getting the trigger of breaking a fast with a protein fat rich meal that triggers the gallbladder to have that big ejection of bile, which emulsifies the fat so you can uptake the nutrition. And so the gallbladder and bile ducts get clogged.
Right.
And that's where you lose your gallbladder. And one of the athletes I actually worked with was Amanda Stevens in her final year of long course triathlon, where she had the most successful year of her career, because she had actually lost her gallbladder at the Olympic Training Center doing Olympic distance triathlon, and because she was on the high carb diet. And we got her on bile salts, and got her fat adapted, and it just made a big difference. But that's another thing that happens, and nobody talks about it. It's so common in medicine now that it's seen as normal.
I know. That's just because everybody's having their gallbladder removed doesn't mean that it's normal, but it is predictable. Yeah.
It's very predictable.
Well, and what's interesting, Peter, is that they have now looked at women with PCOS, which is insulin resistance, and it can be passed on 3 generations. epigenetics. So if the mom has too much sugar in her system, her gallbladder will try and clean up mommy's sugar, but it will not go through the umbilical cord. So now the baby's got all this sugar, and they've done a lot of studies on cord blood and hormone discrepancies. And a lot of little boys now are being born with genitalia inadequacies that they're blaming now on
What's happening in
excess
utero.
estrogen.
Yeah. Well, and to a point, the epidemiology suggests that men's testosterone levels, 50% of it, what it was 50 years ago.
Oh yeah, they're dumbing down now a normal sperm analysis. They've had to dumb it down because nobody would be in the reference range.
I didn't want to go there because the science is pretty new and people don't like to talk about it because it creates a lot of guilt, which people should not have because they're getting the advice. But a lot of children are affected with that genetic thing in utero. It's not just once they're born and what they're eating then. So it predisposes them to weight gain, hormonal imbalances, low T, and all the things we're seeing today. And then on top of that, another pet peeve I have is when you go to these kids games like ASYO soccer and all these different youth sports, they're feeding them sugar.
Oh, I know.
The snacks and drinks are all sugar, and it's like this.
I know.
This is a train wreck. But it's good for the medical industry.